I've brought you here to talk about a murder. The Portopia serial murder case, to be specific. That's why you're here for NES Works Gaiden episode 48. Take a look at this cartridge, please, and answer a question. Where were you at 9 p.m. on the 17th? Were you playing this? This is it, really, the Rosetta Stone for more than 3 decades of Japanese video game design. I keep going back to Super Mario Bros. As a landmark work of game design that would influence countless games to follow. And that remains true. Well, Chunsoft and Enix's Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken may be just as important to role-playing and adventure games as Super Mario Bros. Is to action games. In some ways it seems even more consequential. Where Super Mario naturally evolved a genre and shared many of its concepts with contemporary competing games like Pac-Land and Ghosts and Goblins, Portopia doesn't evolve a genre so much as reinvent it. Director Yuji Horii's creative vision here, and the approach Chunsoft and specifically Koichi Nakamura took in converting Portopia to Famicom, provoked a tidal wave of successors and imitators. Portopia influenced games on several axes. But before we get into that, let's explore the actual history of the game. Note that while Portopia has never officially appeared as an English-language release, I've used DVD Translation's excellent localization patch from 2006 for this recording. They even implemented the Dragon Warrior screen font. Chunsoft had already developed Dordor for Famicom, so its staff had experience with the hardware. But Koichi Nakamura's studio did not originally create Portopia. Rather, it had been put together by Yuji Horii, a fairly young designer who had made his debut with a tennis game that, like Dordor, Enix had picked up for publication by way of a contest. Enix didn't really maintain internal development staff, preferring instead to rely on talent search contests to bulk up their catalog and on trusted contractors to handle the tech and logistics side of the work. Both Horii and Nakamura fell into Enix's orbit around the same time, and they would collaborate on numerous projects over the next decade. The original version of Portopia reinvented the graphical adventure genre into a format specifically crafted to appeal to Japanese audiences. As with role-playing games, adventure games had tremendous popularity among the tech enthusiasts who comprised much of Japan's computer development community in the early 1980s, but those games had a high barrier of entry. Notable adventures of the era came from Western studios, like Sierra Online and Infocom, and they placed an even heavier emphasis on written text than RPGs did. Although English was and is taught in Japanese schools as a matter of course, text adventures require much deeper reading skills than the terse text fragments of an RPG. While a basic grasp of the language will take you far in Wizardry or Ultima, mastering Zork 3 or even King's Quest demands a mastery of grammar and syntax, to say nothing of their creators' love for language-specific puns and other linguistic tricks. Naturally, eager developers in Japan began designing their own games. Eventually, they'd even start writing games in the Japanese language. Although the presumed first ever Japanese-designed text adventure, 1982's Omotesando Adventure, which appeared as a type-and title in ASCII magazine, played entirely in English. In a 2007 interview, Nakamura told me that the premise of Omotesando Adventure, which amounted to navigating the ASCII offices based in Omotesando, Tokyo, captured his attention by giving him a small, somewhat familiar world to explore while leaving the actual details of the environment to his imagination. Around the same time, he said Microcabin's reinvention of Sierra's Mystery House hit stores in Japan and introduced both native Japanese text and simple graphics to the mix. You can still see ripples of the impact these games had on Nakamura's imagination. He credits them as direct inspirations for Spike Chunsoft's recent visual novel 428 Shibuya Scramble. But here, during the early days of the Famicom, they also created a spiritual connection between the two creators, a shared interest in a genre that gave Nakamura an innate understanding of Horii's creation. Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken made its initial debut in June 1983 on the NEC PC6001 home computer and did reasonably well for itself, given the relatively limited audience that a PC game could reach in Japan in 1983. It did well enough that Enix began porting it to other platforms. And naturally, that included the most popular platform on the market, Nintendo's Famicom. Enix had to overcome a few logistical issues first. For one thing, Famicom carts still offered far smaller data storage capacity than computer disks did. Memory paging wouldn't enter the picture until the following year. On top of that, the Famicom's tile-based graphical rendering approach meant that Chunsoft would have to completely reinvent the PC game's line and fill style of visuals to work with the console's capabilities. Yet, they also needed to leave enough storage space on the tiny cart for the game logic and text. After all, this was a story-driven, text-based adventure, despite the graphical elements. The text itself also posed a problem, as the computer version of Portopia made use of a traditional text input parser. Take object, hit person, go place, etc. Yet the Famicom lacked a keyboard, which made text input deeply inconvenient. Well, that's not entirely true. Hudson had released the Famicom Basic keyboard back in 1984, which could have worked. However, that would have fragmented the potential customer base for Portopia on Famicom, while Enix's entire goal with converting the game to Japan's most successful gaming device to date was to reach as many people as possible rather than a subsection of an audience that would be even smaller than the original PC 6001 user base. Thankfully, Nakamura possessed the experience, skill, and media savviness to solve all of these issues and make Portopia possible on Famicom with no significant compromises. On the contrary, his adaptation made for a smoother, faster, more compelling play experience, elevating Horii's work and unleashing its true potential. As it happened, Nakamura had already been thinking in terms of bringing deeper, more substantial games to Famicom to better take advantage of the home nature of the system. In our 27 interview, Nakamura explained his thinking. Arcade games are basically quarter munchers, or 100 yen munchers, he said. With action-based games, you want to try to have the player lose as quickly as possible so they'll put in another coin and keep playing. On the flip side, with Famicom, you'd buy the game, and as long as you had the cartridge, you could play as many times as you want. You didn't necessarily have to make a game that constantly made the player die and start over. What's the point? They already bought the game, so you don't need to make them keep putting in coins. I thought that an adventure game or an RPG would be something that users would be interested in, but those kinds of games weren't available for the Famicom at the time. So I talked to one of my producers at Enix, a person named Cheetah, and I pitched the idea of an RPG to them. Cheetah pointed me to another guy working with us at Enix, Yuji Horii, who had created an adventure game for an older PC. The issue with the Famicom was that it didn't have a lot of memory available. So even if we wanted to create a text adventure with visuals, we couldn't have that many different unique graphics. The neat thing about Portopia is that it had maybe like 20 different images or scenes in it. I figured we could probably fit that within the limitations of the Famicom. The other neat thing about it is that adventure games had been parser-based to that point, where you type in the commands. But around the time we started, there was another game in Horii's adventure series, I think Karuizawa Yuki Anai, and around that time, he added a command-based menu system so that the user could just select commands from a menu instead of typing them in. According to Hardcore Gaming 101's Yuji Horii Mysteries feature, the series actually introduced its menu system in the second game, Hokkaido Renzoku Satsujin, which was developed by Horii with significant help from developer Loginsoft rather than as a solo project. The point is that Portopia's conversion to Famicom happened to arrive at the perfect time for a number of different influences to shape this release into a game that would in turn shape the medium. In fact, Portopia's influence over gaming has proved so pervasive that the game feels almost mundane and by the books almost 40 years after its original debut. You take on the role of a police detective tasked with solving the mystery behind the death of a wealthy bank executive named Kozo. Although his death appears at first glance to have been self-inflicted, somewhat messily with a knife, his status in the newly constructed Kobe-based community of Portopia demands investigation. The entire game takes place through a 3-window screen view. The primary window depicts the current scene through a static, first-person perspective, above a wide window dedicated to descriptive text and dialogue, and to the left of a window dedicated to menu commands and various lists. The screen setup bears a close resemblance to the viewpoint of wizardry, which should come as no surprise. Horii and Nakamura both reportedly encountered and fell in love with wizardry around the time that the original version of Portopia was under development. That influence becomes undeniable near Portopia's endgame, in which players must navigate a first-person maze below the grounds of Kozo's mansion. Horii drew on many inspirations outside of video games while creating Portopia as well. The game evokes 1960s and 70s police procedurals, and you can't help but imagine the player's character as a hard-smoking, hard-drinking Sonny Chiba type. You never see your in-game avatar, however, nor do you ever read their words or thoughts. The first-person metaphor goes far beyond the basic viewpoint. Rather, the voice in the game that adds information and color commentary to the events that unfold comes from your underling, an eager junior detective by the name of Yasu. The menu command system becomes a metaphor for issuing orders to Yasu, who will search rooms, hold your inventory, and even question suspects. In the tradition of whiskey-soaked Showa-era cop shows, questioning takes place in the police HQ interrogation room, where you can summon material witnesses and other suspects. Although the nature of the technology here means that you have minimal options for interacting with characters, the game does a great job of tracking key information for you. When you learn the name of a person of interest, that name instantly appears in your menu of potential witnesses. Likewise, when a relevant location pops up in conversation, that place becomes an option for exploration in the Move menu. It's a very simple system, but it works well and feels remarkably sophisticated and user-friendly for a game of a 1983 vintage. The design methodology of this era normally demanded players keep track of information on their own. Here, you don't really need to write anything down. The menu system acts as a sort of field notebook. That said, Portopia is an adventure game from the early 1980s, and that means it hides a lot of its content behind obtuse requirements and a need for endless trial and error. Early in the game, you need to acquire multiple key items to serve as evidence, which you accomplish by searching specific spots in investigation scenes. Naturally, nothing about these scenes points you to those spots or even indicates anything exists to be found. You just need to choose the search option and scan every spot in every scene over and over again until you come up with the items. Likewise, you unearth a few phone numbers during the course of your investigation, which you can use with the phone menu option. But these numbers only work at specific times and locations. Use them elsewhere and you'll simply receive a busy signal or a message that the number has gone out of service, even though it'll work again when used correctly. You also need to revisit certain scenes and locations multiple times and perform the same or slightly different sequences of actions. While these requirements do frequently unfold naturally as a consequence of the plot, they just as often feel completely arbitrary and demand guesswork or grinding repetition. And to its credit, Portopia does tell a story. The first that we've seen on Famicom. Each of the characters you meet or learn about has their own background and motives. The most obvious suspects in the murder case turn out to be false leads, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily innocent or even cooperative. As you seek out clues and interrogate witnesses and suspects, a decently intriguing web of motives and events takes shape. Your actions have an effect on the Portopia ecosystem, too. As you question witnesses and even take one into custody for unrelated crimes, the players in Kozo's death become spooked and go on the run. Eventually, more murders transpire. And when you finally get to the truth about Kozo's past and his killer's identity, it comes with a few melancholy twists. There's no happy ending to Portopia, but in the end, justice is served. Unsurprisingly, Portopia became a hit on Famicom. Wikipedia's Japanese sources claim that the cartridge moved more than 700,000 copies. That admittedly doesn't put it even in the top 50 most successful Famicom titles of all time, but given the nature of the game and how radically different in style and design it was from other software for the system at the time, Enix and Chunsoft landed quite a remarkable feat. Those numbers also don't reflect just how much Portopia would shape the design of future Famicom games, and really, of games as a whole. As with bands like the Velvet Underground or Can, the relatively modest sales of Portopia belie its influence on future game designers. Following in the wake of Portopia's success, the police investigation adventure genre became a fixture of Japan's gaming scene. Sure, America has Police Quest and Sam & Max, but the format practically stands as a genre unto itself among Japanese developers. Seemingly every development studio in the 1980s tried their hand at detective adventures. Many of those series are still around or have seen remakes or revivals in the past decade, such as Data East's Jake Hunter games and Nintendo's Famicom Detective Club. We've already seen one such game on Gaiden, Loretta no Shozo for SG-1000, which aped Portopia's format so precisely that it even included a first-person maze sequence toward the end. The detective genre became so popular that it spawned parodies and comedy variants. For example, Namco's Sanma no Meitante, which played in a fairly straightforward fashion but starred comedian Sanma Akashiya and adopted a tone to match its celebrity endorsement. Portopia's influence continues to reverberate in contemporary gaming. Goichi Suda and Grasshopper Manufacture got their start with a detective adventure, The Silver Case, which saw a sequel a few years back. And Capcom's Ace Attorney series incorporates elements of the detective adventure format for the investigation half of its Law & Order style courtroom procedurals. Konami's Snatcher similarly infused alternate play modes into its take on the police novel format, adding occasional light gun shootouts to its hard-boiled Blade Runner pastiche. Snatcher's lead designer, Hideo Kojima, has professed the fact that Portopia inspired his decision to become a game creator by opening his eyes to the fact that even console games can convey a narrative with dramatic twists and high stakes. He even borrowed Portopia's subtle sexual harassment option in his work. Though in Portopia's defense, the option to remove a witness's clothes does play a key part in solving the case. Games that delved into the adventure format without concerning cop drama reflect elements of Portopia as well. Hudson's Princess Tomato and the Salad Kingdom Best known for its NES release, but which debuted on personal computers a year after Portopia's original release, doesn't simply incorporate Horii's windowed system. It features a Yasu-like Kobun character to the player's Oyabun, in the form of Percy, an eager-to-please idiot whose childlike demeanor cleverly enables play mechanics, like resetting the player's inventory in each new chapter, in addition to providing commentary on game events. Portopia directly inspired the birth of the visual novel format, too. Nakamura and Horii collaborated for years on the Dragon Quest series, and following the debut of Dragon Quest V, Chunsoft decided to self-publish an original release, Otogiriso, a horror game in which Nakamura says he attempted to simplify the streamlined visual storytelling design of Portopia into an even more minimalist work that his non-gaming family members could experience as well. And needless to say, Horii and Nakamura adopted the same philosophy when they finally collaborated to create the role-playing game they both dreamed of. 1986's Dragon Quest directly adapted Portopia's menu system into the RPG, giving players a quick and easy way to interact with the world despite the meager input options available on the Famicom controller. Dragon Quest also adopted Portopia's philosophy of no fail states. Although players could fall in battle, they didn't die. Rather, the game sent them back to the starting point of the game with all their earned experience and gear intact, exacting only a 50% financial penalty for their goof. But that's a story for another time. NES Works 1989 to be specific. In the context of 1985, Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken stands toe-to-toe with the biggest and most influential Famicom games to this point. It may not have the international clout of a Xevious, or a Super Mario Bros., or even a Tower of Draga, but it heralds a radical change in game development philosophy for the platform and home console games in general. With the arrival of the Famicom Disk System 3 months after Portopia's move to the cartridge format, and the advent of advanced memory mapper chips a few months after that, the console would soon find itself freed from the shackles of in-ROM storage capacity limits and the hardware's innate data bandwidth. Combine the multi-format ambition of Challenger with the smooth, substantial action of Super Mario Bros. And the narrative and inventory mechanics of Portopia, and you've got yourself the recipe for some of the biggest and most influential games of the late 1980s, and beyond. Next time on NES Works Gaiden, we play billiards in the one place still uncorrupted by capitalism: space!